Somewhere outside Jerusalem, roughly 2,000 years ago, a man addresses the most respected, revered group of religious scholars of his generation, and he calls them something so startling, so vicious, that it really still stings up until today. He called them whitewashed tombs, that they had a beauty on the outside but full of death on the inside. He didn't stop there. Among these 7 woes that he uttered toward them, he called them also a brood of vipers, not misguided, not simply wrong, but actually venomous, dangerous people. This man, of course, was Jesus of Nazareth, and these, of course, were the Pharisees that were being addressed. And so who were these Pharisees? They were really the most learned, most devout, most respected leaders of the religious class of first century Judaism. They weren't criminals, they weren't outsiders, these were the actual insiders. They were the people that other people went to find answers. And so what were they actually, and where did they get their power? And why did the most religious people in the room, so to speak, at the time become fierce enemies of Jesus? And why did he become their fierce enemy? And then what happened actually to one of their own in the end, who was a real star, a rising star of the time, who was an actual Pharisee from a very young age? What happened to him on a desert road later on would directly turn around a lot of religious history, and in many ways give us what we enjoy today in the canon of the Bible. But today we're going to go inside the world of the Pharisees, look back at their history, look back at how they operated, what they did day to day, and get a sense entirely, really, of the entire political, religious framework that was in place when Jesus arrived. And so stay with us and stay tuned for many more episodes coming up, because we're going to hit those other groups: Sadducees, Zealots, Essenes, Herodians, all these different groups that constituted the political framework, the atmosphere of that day. So please subscribe to Supernatural History. As I say, we've got a lot more upcoming, but let's get in deeper with the Pharisees. So the story of the Pharisees, it doesn't start with Jesus. We think it started about 200 years prior, and it was the middle of a revolution. It was the 2nd century BC, a group known as the Hasidim. They also, I think that transliterated was pious ones in the Hebrew. But they fought along Judah Maccabee in his revolt against the Greek Empire that was trying to force, not to worship, actually by force. And the Hasidim, they ended up making peace with the Greeks. But the Maccabees, they were not satisfied. They wanted to keep fighting for total political independence. They wanted the yoke of Greece off them. And they wanted to be left alone, really, to keep the law. And really, out of this, they think the seed was born of the Pharisees, out of this pious sort of remnant out of the Hasidim birth this sect of religious scrutiny in the Pharisees. But the name itself literally comes from separated ones, is what a Pharisee means. And they're separated from impurity, and some scholars would argue they were separated from Jewish establishment, that they no longer trusted after the way the Hasidim sort of caved to the Greek overtures. But the first time we see really clearly named in history was under the Hasmonean ruler named Jarn Hyrcanus. It was the late 2nd century BC, and then Josephus, he tells us there was a public break between Hyrcanus and the Pharisees after they questioned his legitimacy as the high priest. So you do that, I think you're in bad shape, and they split completely. But from that point on, the Pharisees started appearing again and again in historical records, sometimes in favor with the ruling dynasty, actually, and sometimes not. And sometimes they actually got punished. There was a ruler, a Hasmonean king named Alexander Jannaeus, and for some reason the Pharisees were really mad. They pelted him with fruit during a festival, and then records indicate that he answered. They crucified, by some accounts, 800 of his opponents for this whole fruit-led debacle at the festival. But rabbinic tradition, they tell us that the way the Pharisees operated was a chain of paired teachers, and generation after generation it would get passed down like a torch. It was a president and a chief judge were at the top. And then some of the earliest names they know were in the chain. They're really legendary names, even though we can't really verify them independently. But the chain ends at the time of closer to Jesus was Hillel and Shammai. And then about the turn of the millennium, right around the time that Jesus came on the earth, that Hillel and Shammai, they had two rival schools of interpretation. It was Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. And they clashed over 300 different points just in the law. on how to keep the Sabbath, how divorce should work, or even down to the nth degree about how you should handle food, purity rules. So no law, no stone was left unturned. And then the Talmud remembers the two men almost like opposite temperaments. Shammai was sort of stricter reading, more hardcore on legal matters. And then they think that Hillel was more patient, and that Hillel would even quote different teachings of Shammai in his actual teaching of his own students. So that brought about a lot more respect overall. And while Shammai did not offer him the same in return, but in many ways they felt like heaven and God actually favored both, that they were teaching right out of what would they consider to be the words of the living God. But ultimately they felt like heaven would rule in Hillel's favor for reasons of being, like I said, he would favor even Shammai's teaching, or he was more humble, more down to earth, so to speak. So heaven really seemed to favor Hillel. How they grasped that idea, I'm not sure. But that was kind of the mode of thinking at that time, as Hillel was really the most respected. And then for 2,000 years before Rome finally destroyed the Jewish temple in 70 AD, the temple was really run by the Sadducees, but after the temple was destroyed, they completely vanished. But what really lived on was the Pharisees and their oral tradition especially. But it got reorganized by a guy named Yohanan ben Zakkai, who was a scribe that survived but continued the oral traditions. And they think it became sort of the foundation of what we know as Rabbinic Judaism today. So every rabbi, every synagogue you see, nearly every form of Judaism that's practiced anywhere on earth today, it goes back to the intellectual lineage, really, of that one man, Zakkai's enduring legacy, that moment that he survived after the destruction. But it's not just a top layer within the Pharisees. They don't run everything to Sadducees. They're more from birthright, political appointment, the wealthier class. But the Pharisees on the other side, almost like Democrats and Republicans, they're more on scholarship, mastery of oral law, and more on, again, the personal piety of taking every little tithe to the nth degree. And then at the top, you had the Sanhedrin, that really was the whole nation's high council. The Pharisees had influence there, and sometimes were a majority of seats, but that also came from what's called the Nazi and the Av Bet Din. They were the president, chief judge, and the paired leadership that would ultimately represent the Pharisees in the high council. And then below them, you had something called the Zugat. They were sage pairs like Shammai, and they ran the leading schools of thought. They did things like copy texts, draft documents. They were the ones teaching out in the local community. And then below them, at what the grassroots level would be, there was a group called the Shavarim. And it literally meant the fellowship, the Shavarim. But to become a Shaver, I don't know why I'm saying that accent, but it wasn't automatic. It required an actual vow. And you had to commit to tithe everything you ate, you sold, or you bought. And you had to maintain an absolute strict ritual purity. And so they were just a step up from the ordinary Jewish population. It was, rabbinic sources called them the Am Haaretz. They were the people of the land. And then another text called the Mishnah, they devote an entire section called the Dimeh to the rules that govern these fellowship meals. So the Shavarim, when they ate together, they would trust each other's tithing, and they found sort of they would always sit at a formal table, an exclusive table where the common people couldn't sit. They weren't a part of it. So in a way, there was separation. They were sort of an elite class, even the lowest level of the Pharisees. And so it's really a bit strange. You have this religious sect that's supposed to be of the people, but they have this formal membership tier, and it's built on how you just handle everything, your groceries, all of your rituals, but you have to adhere to these rules to be a part of them. But so through it all, really Jewish history, the last 2,000 years, when you get down to it, in a lot of ways, the Pharisees, they've sort of carried it on. They've been the purveyors of rabbinic history ever since the destruction. And it does surprise most people, but the Pharisees, they were not actually priests. And they didn't run the temple. They didn't perform the sacrifices. That was all done by their rivals, the Sadducees. And the Sadducees, I said, they were the wealthier aristocratic class, and they were tied totally in the priesthood, and they received all the revenue through that sacrifice, that whole system. So that tells you about where their sort of allegiances lie. But they were more, the Pharisees, they were the common people, the tradesmen, the merchants, the scribes, and they held ordinary jobs while they did all of their work, their studying of the law, and they sort of prided in the fact that they could do this great work, but also be members of the community performing jobs. And rabbinic wisdom would always put it plainly that it's excellent to study the Torah together along with having a worldly occupation. So the real innovation at the time really was that they took laws that applied inside the temple, like purity, holiness, ritual washing, and they sort of got it out into ordinary daily life, into the normal people. So what the Pharisees constructed, you would adhere to in your kitchen, in the Sabbath, at your home. And so to the Pharisees, they were really sort of exporting holiness. They didn't think it happened just in the temple building, but they thought it was something you had to carry with you everywhere. And really because that, they really weren't an isolated small elite, but they did have still ties very much in the community, even though there was that level of elite sort of where they ate. And Josephus actually tells us plainly that it was really the Sadducees. They had the real confidence of the wealthy by themselves, but the Pharisees really had the multitude on their side at the end of the day. So ordinary people trusted them, respected them. And there was a case where 6,000 people, along with the Pharisees, they got them to sort of defy a direct order of Herod the Great himself, which ended in all these people having to pay fines. No one reportedly was killed, but it's an example of how the Pharisees could lead the people in something they believed in. And they ran everything really through being a teacher and sort of a disciple. But they had another disciple, as I mentioned, who came along in a local synagogue, and if you were a young sort of prodigy, you would study at the feet of one of the great sages. That was the most honorable thing you could do. And there was a man or a kid back then in a Roman city called Tarsus, but he was a Jewish boy, and in his world, everything was about getting to that place. His name was Saul, of course, and he trafficked in his father's trade of leather work, tent making, but he had the pleasure of being sent to Jerusalem as a young man for the best sort of education, money, and reputation could buy anyone. And he studied at the feet of Gamaliel. And so Gamaliel at the time was really the most respected Pharisee sage, and he was a grandson of Hillel, who was sort of the most vaunted, most celebrated Pharisee of all. And later Saul even described himself as the Hebrew of Hebrews, if you remember. And as to the law, he was a Pharisee through and through. And he was so ahead of other boys his age, and he became so zealous in these traditions that any measure they used, he was exactly what a Pharisee was supposed to be. Considered really a rising star. And we'll come back to him, but what happens to Saul of Tarsus really became one of the most dramatic reversals sort of in religious history, and especially among Pharisees. I mean, this would have been unheard of, unfathomable. But really the Pharisees, they didn't operate in a vacuum. In first century Judea, it was really a pressure cooker of these competing religious factions all about. And all of them thought they really represented the true will of God. They were convinced, and they all really despised one another. Obviously, with the Pharisees, their most hated rivals were the Sadducees, but there were these other factions, and the split wasn't just social, but it was really priestly. And it came down to theological arguments, and came down really all the way to the most finite of arguments, because the Sadducees, they only accepted the Torah, but the Pharisees, they accepted that plus centuries of their oral tradition, and they accepted other writings as well. And the Sadducees, they even said there's no resurrection, no angels, no spirits. But the Pharisees, they acknowledged all of those. So it was really, they were on two different opposite sides of the coin entirely. And then when Paul, he got put on trial at one point, but the way he sort of divided the entire trial and was able to make an escape for himself was he just knew the fault lines, and he just uttered one sentence about the resurrection. He knew that would create such a firestorm, such a shouting match, and it did. And records say that he was able to escape the punishment, whatever that was he was facing. But there was some real hostility there, and it didn't just come down to books or scripture in the first place, but as I said, the Sadducees, they were only about the Torah, nothing else, those 5 books of Moses. But the Pharisees, they had really a broad canon, and they had the Torah, the prophets as they were known, another text called the writings, and really it was just the entire text of what we would now call the Bible. And they just stacked it along with their oral tradition, but we would probably say they were very astute in doing that. And even including the book of Isaiah, which was a very controversial inclusion back in their day, mainly because of Isaiah 53, which we'll get to, but because they found, really, I mentioned this on the episode with Lilith, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found something called the Great Isaiah Scroll, and they dated it just at 125 AD, which I stated in that episode is, I believe, completely false. When you look at something called the book of Ben Sirah was a respected prophet, priest, around 200 BC himself. And in his book of Ben Sirah, or maybe it was Ecclesiastica, but he references maybe in both Simon the Just, who was I guess he was an official at that time, but I think most of all scholarship does agree that Simon the Just died around 196 BC. So it just makes it irrefutable that Isaiah had to be written before this period, just based on that one fact, and the fact also that there was no mention of any revolution, Maccabean revolt, which was around 165 BC, but that's a bit of an aside. But the real point I'm getting to is that Isaiah 53 was really a line of demarcation among many of these groups, because as we would read it today, we would find that it's definitely referencing the Messiah, Jesus Christ, in really a clear way, calling him in that passage a suffering servant who was wounded for our transgressions and crushed for our iniquities. And that seems pretty clear. That's talking about Jesus the Messiah. In fact, when Jesus read that in front of the religious establishment, they rent their clothes. They were ready to throw him off a cliff, and basically saying that's me you're reading. And of course, Jesus is he is the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. But when we look back at the rabbinic tradition back then, especially at that time, they had no patience for Isaiah 53 or other parts of Scripture that the Pharisees did actually recognize. And there's an Aramaic translation of something called the Prophets. It was called the Targum Jonathan, but it also recognizes, and it was an important text at the time, that was the Messiah indeed, and that the Talmud itself actually nicknames the coming Messiah the leper scholar. And I'm not sure how that applied to Jesus in his own words, but meaning that he was being stricken almost word for word is how they explain it. But when you look at it all the way through it, there's an incident actually where Philip, I believe he converts a eunuch, I believe he was. But that eunuch was reading Isaiah 53 at the time when Philip happened upon him, and he told him that scripture's already been fulfilled, and that's actually describing the death of Jesus himself. And so that's another important event in the Bible that it records, that they were recognizing Isaiah 53 at that time, obviously especially Philip, and he knew the exact meaning of that passage. But in that time also, there, as I mentioned, the other groups, there wasn't just the Pharisees, really, and the Sadducees, but there was the wilderness around the Dead Sea. There was another group called the Essenes. They'd walked away from the mainstream Jewish society almost entirely. They lived in a commune. They prized ritual purity well above, such an extreme degree, even above the Pharisees. And they had their own library of text that were really controversial for the Jewish mainstream. Maybe that was part of them getting out into the wilderness, out of the mainstream, out into the commune. But they had texts that recognized the Watchers, which we actually covered on the first episode of this channel. But they recognized the Watchers, and they saw the link between Genesis 6 and the Watchers. And they even tried to make links, those same sort of Nephilim links, to the Pharisees at the time. We're going to get into that in a later episode, which is fascinating. But I've heard other scholarship also try to make that link too, that the Pharisees had some, that maybe they're part of the serpent seed. But we'll get into that. I'm not sure what I think about that yet. I'm going to have to research that quite a bit more. But that's really a deep topic. But we'll get into that another time. I think maybe there's certainly nothing in Scripture that would make any sort of link in that way. But yeah, but the Nephilim traditions, and they also made links to even other sects as well as the Pharisees. So it wasn't strictly the Pharisees they were singling out as possible links back to the Nephilim, to the Watchers. But then there was a group called the Zealots. They were an armed resistance to the Roman occupation, Josephus tells them they really spawned about 6 AD from a tax revolt against the Romans. And then another splinter actually happened from the Zealots called the Sicarii. They were dagger men that went around and they tried to assassinate any Roman collaborator they found, broad daylight, wherever they saw them. And so they became disinterested in sort of debating the law, and they just wanted to, by any means possible, by force, to get Rome out. And then you had this other group called the Herodians, and they were they were a political faction entirely loyal to the Herod dynasty, and they had really nothing in common with the Pharisees theologically because of that. But in the Gospels, on a couple of occasions, they teamed up, the Pharisees, the Herodians, and they worked against Jesus. I guess an enemy of my enemy is my friend, but they tried to get Jesus destroyed after a Sabbath healing, and then they tried to team up in the incident where they tried to question him about paying taxes to Caesar. So that's kind of a brief look at the entire landscape at the time where the Pharisees fit in. But the old rivalries, they'd get set aside in some cases because the Sadducees, essentially, they controlled the temple, as I mentioned, but they chaired the ruling council as well. But the Pharisees, they would be able to hold something more powerful. All would agree is that the Pharisees had the people on their side. They were the most plugged into the people, and they had this group, this army of people that would come to their aid whenever they wanted them to. And there was an incident back in 62 AD where he was a Sadducean high priest, but he overstepped and he was actually involved in executing James, the brother of Jesus. And he did so without Roman authorization. So the public was very outraged, and they got him removed from office in a couple of weeks. Doesn't say they actually killed him, but this was the sort of high stakes landscape that Jesus was walking into. He was walking into this Galilean rabbi was about to walk into this faction and threaten all these groups, everything that existed, this tenuous peace maybe they had enough to sort of live and coexist with one another. So what actually did go wrong with Jesus and the Pharisees? I mean, from their side, they would say that the grievances, they stacked up pretty fast. There was the healing on the Sabbath, and he would do it in such a public way. He did it a number of times. He'd do it deliberately, in fact, almost to provoke them. And they didn't really view the Sabbath as any sort of debatable issue. The Sabbath was to be kept holy. It almost superseded other things. So it was so egregious to them that he would heal a man. He healed a paralyzed man on the Sabbath, and he did it right in front of them. And he even said that God gave him the authority to do it. And then obviously he ate with the tax collectors, the most hated, the open sinners. And he just started a holiness movement that separated from the religious sort of traditions and really threatened all of the religious tradition at the time. So you can see in many ways they were just worried about their own pocketbooks, their survival, and it became a real political liability for them. In fact, they said at one point, even in the Gospels, that the council fears that if we let him go on doing this, everyone's going to believe him, and the Romans will come, they'll take away our holy place and our nation entirely. So for them, it wasn't just a theological argument, it was about everything that they'd come to build and the very survival into the next phase of their development as a sect. But from Jesus' side, it was obviously one of the most famous confrontations in the New Testament, but he gave them that set of denunciations I referenced called the 7 woes. But he accused them of saying one thing, doing another, of obsessing over or tithing garden herbs. You remember the mint, the dill, the cumin. They were so meticulous, even down to such a nth degree. And they neglected, he thought, some of the weightier matters of the law, the justice, mercy, faithfulness, the real important things. But they would focus on the little things. They would turn prayer and fasting and charity into public performance. They wanted to be seen at the gatherings, the dinners, and admired. And they just loaded people down, he felt, Jesus did, with these religious burdens. And they really didn't have a heart for people in the end. It was really more about their status. And they'd grown into the status sort of seeking behavior. And then when he calls them whitewashed tombs, that image, it wasn't really just some poetry he was using. There was a real Jewish practice that was well known at the time. It would be well known to the readers at the time and anyone who heard him issue that epithet. But every year before Passover, the tombs around Jerusalem, they painted them all a bright white color not to make them look good, but it was really more of a warning that if you're a pilgrim, if you're flooding in the city into a festival and you brush against one of these graves, you're considered ritually impure. And this would identify you as being ritually impure, and you'd have to be banished out of the festival. And so for them, the whitewashed tomb, it was by design. It was just, they made this beautiful surface, but we know what was underneath. It was death. It was the grave. And that was the accusation. It wasn't really simple hypocrisy, but it was more of a warning sign he was giving them, that they were painted over. They were hiding exactly what they were intending to hide. It was really the depth of the wretchedness in their heart. And then when he called them, obviously, the brood of vipers among the seven woes, it wasn't just saying misguided teachers, but it was something venomous, something dangerous. And they were wearing a respectable face, which is even more dangerous. And so it's easy to miss, though, that from 2,000 years away, as he addressed all these Pharisees, they weren't entirely a monolith. There were good, sort of, better Pharisees within the group, you could say. And then there was the cautious sage Gamaliel. He was an exemplary person. And he even warned and argued for mercy on the council with the Jesus movement, that everyone should relax and let Jesus sort of do his thing out there. Of course, Nicodemus, we read about that story where Jesus asked him, what does it mean to be born again? He came to Jesus, he was searching, he wasn't condemning, but there was just more diversity in the movement that we know about. And sometimes the gospel shows us some of that, but some of the historians, such as Josephus, would tell us that some of these ways in which they did things that furthered the Jesus movement at the time weren't really recognized. And then many people think that the Pharisees had this intimate involvement in the death of Jesus, but that wasn't in fact the case. They weren't involved. It was actually Caiaphas was the high priest, of course. We all know that name, but he in fact was a Sadducee, and he was part of that religious framework that was very loyal to Rome, very loyal to, in order to get their money and their revenues paid. But a Sadducee was actually heading that entire effort to crucify Jesus. And they held a lot of power at the time politically, but maybe they weren't historically to blame for the entire unraveling of the political system that brought Jesus down. So, and then we remember Saul of Tarsus. He was the brilliant young Pharisee under the study of Gamaliel, zealous beyond his years, but as we know, he didn't stay a promising student for long. That he became something far more dangerous ultimately, and when he became Paul, the Apostle Paul. But prior to that, he was actually involved in the murder of Stephen, and when he actually, they think he was actually the one responsible who gave the final nod to go ahead and stone Stephen to death, which was done. It was said that Stephen saw Jesus at the right hand of the Father when that happened. But that didn't seem to stop Paul until he was blinded on the road to Damascus. And by his later account, they would say that he really persecuted the followers of Jesus to death. That was his stated purpose. And he even threw men and women in prison, and even murdered some people in the process. But he would pursue city to city. He was armed with the letters of authority from the high priest himself, so he had the ultimate authority to carry out and really do what he wanted. It almost reminds me of the Nazis sort of cleaning out anyone that was in their way. But while he was on his way, he was continuing his hunting efforts on his way to Damascus. That's when he was blind. He heard the voice saying, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And he had the 3 days of blindness, of course. And when his sight finally returned, the man who emerged was no longer the Pharisee that he set out on that road. He was no longer this zealous enforcer of the old system. He really became one of the most radical voices for the very movement he had tried to destroy. So one of the most ardent Pharisees became one of the biggest opponents of the Pharisees. And so he spent the rest of his life as the Apostle Paul. And he was the same man, again, I said, he studied at the feet of Gamaliel. And he still continued to work as a tent maker, so he did carry an occupation as well. Not that that was strictly exclusive to the Pharisees, but they took a lot of pride in the fact that they did that. But Paul continued to work as a tent maker. I'm sure he needed to bring some money in also. But when you look at everything that was involved, the Pharisee education, the zeal, the trade, and then the total final reversal, he's really the sort of emblematic of what we see that really Jesus can do to a life, can do to a person, the way he can turn around someone and make them an entirely new creation. And I know that's evident really with every person who is born again, as Nicodemus sought through Jesus. But I guess at the end of the day, that's the story of the Pharisees, the tradition that they they upheld, but it undergirds all of the Jewish tradition that we have in place today, all the entire rabbinical system, anything you see, as I said, the rabbis, the synagogues, all these traditions that are held through, they really date back to the Pharisees. And the Pharisees, you could say, are the most responsible for continuing that historical legacy into today's times. And so in many ways, a lot of Jewish people have them to thank for the fact that all these traditions, all these oral traditions held through that destruction in 70 AD, when you look back at it. So that's really sort of when you get back to whitewashed tomb, that's kind of the takeaway I take from this is we all can be whitewashed, I'm sure, to some degree, without the blood of Jesus. I mean, none of us is righteous. We all have a certain amount of whitewashed tomb to us, that what we put on the exterior and what we live on the inside. But how much we can marry those up is all really a function of how close we are to Jesus, how much the Holy Spirit works through us. So that's where we're going to go with the Pharisees. That's where we've taken it. We're going to get in, as I said, to the Sadducees, I believe, next. Then we'll hit the Herodians, the Essenes, the Zealots. And then what I want to get to as well is what's going to probably be really something I thought about for a long time, but it's going to be pretty controversial, is the origins of this transgender movement. Because I know you look back at Astarte or Astarte or Inanna, and obviously the Baphomet, all these different sources we have, all these different accounts we have of, especially I think with Inanna, she would castrate men who were part of her caste. So I really want to get into that. It's something I really want to research and be able to present to you and give to you, because I think it's really illuminating in so many ways, because we know there's nothing new under the sun. There's no new movement. There's no new ideas, really. It's just a rehash, a recycle of everything that's been done before. So we're going to look back at what's been done before and sort of compare it to what's going on today, and where did that movement end up? How pervasive did it become in those societies versus what we're looking at now? It seems to have such a grip and a hold on society. You have what they call the alphabet mafia, that you must comply in many ways with whatever the alphabet mafia lays down. But that's where we're going to end it on Pharisees. So I hope you enjoyed it. Like I say, subscribe, and we're going to see you in the next one, probably on the Sadducees. Thanks.